Vandeham Sri Guru Sri Juta Padakamalam Sri Gurun.
Welcome back to the online Bhakti Sastri course. In our previous lesson number 5, we were looking at Krishna's response to Arjuna's question about the characteristics of the liberated soul, and the verses from text 54 to 72 of the second chapter describe those symptoms in terms of the question Arjuna asked: how does he sit, how does he walk, what is his language, how does he speak, etc. We were discussing the param drištva, the higher taste of engagement in Krishna's service, and how that can protect one from being attracted to the materialistic activities. And we discussed the reasons why Krishna is recommending karma yoga over karma sannyas. Today we're carrying on with lesson number 6, chapter 3, verses 10 to 43. Let's take a look at an overview of chapter 3. In the beginning, Arjuna asks Krishna, "O Janardana, O Keshav, why do you want to engage me in this ghastly warfare if you think that intelligence is better than fruitive work?" So again, Arjuna is indicating he's still not clear on these two aspects of the jnana and renunciation and the karma, and how these two can simultaneously be performed. "My intelligence is bewildered by your equivocal instructions, therefore please tell me directly which will be most beneficial for me." You can see in the verse, Tad ekam vad nishchit. Just say one thing. You're saying two things. Arjuna is confused. You're saying I should develop jnana, and you're saying I should fight and perform my duty. So Arjuna is still thinking that jnana would mean renunciation of one's work. And he hasn't been able to put together the concepts of working with renunciation as karma yoga. So he's asking, just say one thing. And Krishna will say just one thing in this chapter. That one thing is called karma yoga. That's working according to your prescribed duties in the varnashram system without attachment for the result. That means that you're doing your karma with knowledge, and that is called karma yoga. We were discussing in our previous lesson how Krishna is recommending over karma yoga to karma sannyas, and many reasons for that. We'll discuss that in a later session, verses 10 to 16 of the third chapter, where Krishna is explaining how by practicing karma kanda, one gradually elevates oneself and comes to the level of karma yoga. In verses 17 to 21, which we'll be discussing shortly in this session, how the self-realized soul, the Atmarati, who has no material desire, he has no need to perform the regulations of the Varnashram Dharma. However, there's no harm in him doing that, and he can do that to set an example. And the rest of the chapter up to text 35 is dealing with that. Krishna gives himself as an example of performing Varnashram Dharma. And then the topic of lust is introduced in the end of the third chapter, considering that as Krishna is encouraging Arjuna to perform your prescribed duty, so Arjuna is asking, what is it that induces us to perform sin and go against our prescribed duty? And in that way, the third chapter is concluded, as Krishna describes some principles regarding lust. We were discussing Varnashram Dharma in previous lessons. Prabhupada's commenting in the purport to 231. On the bodily plane, Swadharma is called Varnashram Dharma, or man's stepping stones for spiritual understanding. Human civilization begins from the stage of Varnashram Dharma. It's interesting, the analogy, the metaphor that Prabhupada uses here. Varnashram Dharma is like a stepping stone. We use stepping stones here in Mayapur in a rainy season. Oftentimes there is flooding, sometimes major flood. But generally, particular areas that are low-lying become filled with water. And the devotees, they put stepping stones to help you get across those puddles. So how long do you remain on the stepping stone? Not very long. Basically, as quick as you can, you're in and out. And it's an interesting analogy that Prabhupada uses, that Varnashram Dharma and perfection of Varnashram Dharma is not the goal, but Varnashram Dharma is simply the the means by which we attain the goal of Krishna consciousness, or one contributing factor. Now it's interesting that Prabhupada quotes this verse from Bhagavatam, where Narad Muni is instructing Vyasadeva, after Vyasadeva was dissatisfied in spite of compiling extensively so much Vedic literature, the Puranas, the Upanishads, the Vedanta Sutra, Itihas, etc. Still he wasn't feeling satisfied. And Narad Muni came and he was preaching to Vyasadeva at the time. So Narad's explaining there regarding Varnashram Dharma, Kovarta Abtam Abhajitam Sadharmataha. That Kovarta means where is, Kovarta Apta, the gain of Abhajitam means without devotional service, Svadharma. So Narad is asking that what is the use of Varnashram Dharma if it is without devotional service to the Lord? So he's asking it in a rhetorical way, meaning that there is no use. There is no use. Even though the system is Vedic system and it's traditional, classic means of liberating oneself from the material world. In the Kali Yuga particularly, the process is so gradual that hardly one is making progress. And sometimes I get caught in the traffic jams in Chennai and in Kolkata and in Mumbai, and I think oftentimes that if the traffic was going any slower, we'd be going backwards. So Varnashram Dharma, just trying to achieve this, just performing that without the simple activity of chanting Hare Krishna, Narad's saying that there is very little gain. Now, compared to Krishna consciousness in a previous verse, an interesting comment Prabhupada makes in the Swalpam abhiyasya dharmasya traite mahato bhayat nehebrikura nasosti pratavaya navijite verse. That's the 40th verse of the second chapter. On this path there is no loss nor diminution. Now, in the purport, Prabhupada comments that a little advancement in Krishna consciousness can save one from the most dangerous type of fear. And then he's explaining in the purport the transcendental nature of Krishna consciousness. Listen carefully. Activity in Krishna consciousness, or acting for the benefit of Krishna without expectation of sense gratification, is the highest transcendental quality of work. Even a small beginning of such activity finds no impediment, nor can that small beginning be lost at any stage. In one simple phrase, Prabhupada has defined the whole essence of devotional service. Activity in Krishna consciousness, or acting for the benefit of Krishna without expectation of sense gratification. That is pure devotional service. Acting for the benefit of Krishna without any personal interest. That's called Anukulena Krishna Anushilanam, as we'll be discussing and studying when we discuss the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the opening verse, Rupa Goswami. He defines devotional service. Anyabhilashita shunya jnana karmadi anabritam anukulena Krishna Anushilanam bhaktir uttam. Bhaktir Uttam, the first class devotional service, Anukulena Krishna Anushilanam, is cultivated favorably for Krishna, whatever Krishna wants. Anya Abhilashita Shunya, without any other interest, without any personal interest of the practitioner, particularly desires for material remuneration, desires for heavenly advancement, promotion to the heavenly planets, or desires for liberation. Pure devotional service is devoid of these. And even a little bit of activity on the pure devotional level, in other words, some service to Krishna in that mood, this is for your pleasure, to Krishna. This activity, the result of this activity is never lost, because it is directly on the eternal platform. It's like you're simply reactivating your eternal nature by these simple activities of devotional life. Now, in comparison, the activities of Varnashram Dharma, they are not, the results of the activities of Varnashram Dharma are not eternal. They are exhausted. In fact, Krishna specifically mentions in the 9th chapter, on his more confidential knowledge, Kshane Punya. Kshane Punya, the results of Varnashram Dharma are exhausted. Kshane Punya, Martya Lokam Vishanti. And one comes back to the starting point. And all of that effort of following the prescribed duties and according to the varnas and ashrams, even the result may extend over some lives. You may be enjoying prosperity in this life as a result of your punya, karma, your varnashram, following Varnashram Dharma in previous life. So it appears to be similar to the results of spiritual activities, because the results may extend over several lives, but it's not eternal. as Krishna is mentioning here and Prabhupada's commenting, that those transcendent, and therefore we use the word, Prabhupada, which we often hear, but perhaps we don't reflect on its full significance, the highest transcendental quality of work. And that's not a sentiment because we're devotees, so we consider we're the best. No. By logic, we can see it is the highest quality of work because it is directly on the eternal spiritual platform. And simply by acting in that way, one is reviving his eternal spiritual identity. Here's some questions that you can consider. We'll give you an exercise here to explore. Under what circumstances is following Varnashram Dharma necessary? And what are the qualifications required for the practice of Krishna consciousness? Answer those two questions by referring to the following verses, 231, 35, 326, and 335. Let's answer these questions. Under what circumstances is following Varnashram Dharma necessary? In the purport to 231, Prabhupada comments, there are two kinds of swadharma, or specific duties. As long as one is not liberated, one has to perform the duties of his particular body in accordance with the religious principles in order to achieve liberation. So the principles of the Varna and Ashram Dharma, the swakarma, prescribed duties according to one's particular social position, they have to be performed and maintained to the, up to the point which a person is affected by the modes of material nature. Until one is completely liberated, one is required to act according to the required regulations of the different varnas and different ashrams in order to properly interact with the material energy, considering the modes of material nature that are influencing that person, in order to act in such a way which is considered pious and beneficial, and to avoid sinful activities. One has to follow the prescribed duties of the various varnas and ashramas. What are the qualifications required for beginning the practice of Krishna consciousness? Prabhupada's commenting in the purport to 326 that a slightly developed Krishna conscious person may directly be engaged in the service of the Lord without waiting for other Vedic formulas. For this fortunate man, there is no need to follow the Vedic rituals, because by direct Krishna consciousness, one can have all the results one would otherwise derive from following one's prescribed duties. So it's not required that one has a history of performance of Varnashram Dharma in order to make one eligible for practicing devotional service. As Prabhupada mentions here, a slightly developed Krishna conscious person. We could say that the actual goal of the following of the regulative principles of the Varnashram Dharma is to awaken some interest in serving Krishna. As a result of the purification and the accumulated piety, one becomes inclined to spirituality and becomes interested in serving Krishna. Now, Prabhupada mentions here that a slightly developed Krishna conscious person, even a person may not have done any of the regulative requirements of the Varnashram Dharma, if somehow or other he has some attraction, as Prabhupada mentions, a slightly developed Krishna conscious person, some slight attraction, then he can immediately begin the activities of Krishna consciousness. There's no need to follow the Vedic rituals, there's no need to wait without waiting for other Vedic formulas. This can be facilitated in our activities of preaching Krishna consciousness. Just for example, what is the qualification required for a person to take darshan of Lord Jagannath on the Rath Yatra day, on the Rath cart of Lord Jagannath? What is the qualification required to take darshan of Lord Jagannath? There's no qualification required. All that needs is you need to have the good fortune of just being there on the street when Lord Jagannath comes past. Whether you're a pious person or a sinful person is no distinction in terms of your eligibility to receive the mercy of Lord Jagannath. Simply by taking darshan of Lord Jagannath, who's situated on the Rath on the Rath Yatra day, one doesn't take birth again in this world. That's how powerful it is, how tremendous a simple darshan of Lord Jagannath on the Rath Yatra can be. And everyone is equally eligible for that. Hearing the Mahamantra, hearing the Kirtan, who's eligible to hear the Kirtan? There is no eligibility. Simply one has to be fortunate enough to be in the vicinity of the Kirtan. I remember when I was in art school, before I became a devotee, and our devotees were in the town, Melbourne, in the restaurant, Crossways restaurant, and they would distribute prasadam. In the day, actually, I would go for prasadam too. It was very budget. In fact, it was free in those days. And after prasadam, the devotees would clean up the kitchen, the restaurant, and then they would go on Harinam for an hour or so. As I was coming back from the college each afternoon, it just happened to be the time that the devotees were on the street doing the Harinam. I couldn't see the devotees, but each time as I would ride through on my push bike, ride through the middle of the city, I could hear every afternoon, I could hear the cartels that they were in a different place in the town walking and doing the Harinam. But that sound of the Harinam, it entered my consciousness and had an effect on me, purified me. So what was my qualification? No qualification. It's just a good fortune that the devotees were kind to decide to go on Harinam and in that way benedict the whole of the city. This is Krishna consciousness. What are the qualifications required for taking prasadam? There is no qualification. All that you're required to do is to just be willing to accept the prasadam and not throw it away. And just that's all. And that may be some qualification there that you agree to accept. That may be some result of some previous pious activity which is influencing you. But it's not depending upon a previous pious activity. It's actually dependent upon the mercy of the preacher and the expertise of the preacher. We can see in the case of Srila Prabhupada, because he's particularly empowered preacher, Krishna Shakti Vina Nahitara Pravatana, especially empowered, directly empowered by Krishna, and Prabhupada, simply by his association, it could awaken such an interest in Krishna consciousness in so many conditioned souls who are from sinful backgrounds, just because of his potent association. And therefore, as the kindness of the preacher, Prabhupada, he could have remained in Vrindavan. He could have perfected his spiritual life. He would have gone to Krishna, gone back to Godhead, no question. Completely sinless, completely pure, ananya bhajan. But Prabhupada didn't remain in Vrindavan. He left Vrindavan. And as a result of him taking that effort, then so many people became inspired in Krishna consciousness. So the spreading of Krishna consciousness doesn't depend upon the eligibility of the candidates, in particular their accumulated pious credits as a result of punya karma, varnashram dharma. Spreading of Krishna consciousness is dependent upon the enthusiasm and inspiration of the devotees who are kind upon the conditioned souls. Krishna said, Tomar Krishna dite pado, who share Krishna consciousness in their preaching, and by their mercy, the conditioned souls receive that eligibility. This is the mood of the Panchatattva. Patra patra bicha nahe, naheshtan ashtan. They do not consider their eligibility, the qualification of the receptive instrument, the patra, the pot, patra apatra, a useful pot and a non-useful pot, acceptable, non-acceptable. Bicha nahe, they don't consider. Ashtan ashtan, the circumstances. Inappropriate, auspicious, they don't consider. Jai deha pa taha, kore prem dan. Whoever they randomly came across, they're distributing the holy name. Radha Krishna bolore shabai, eshikani shab nadiya fiche neche gornitai. Randomly distributing love of God. This is the Sankirtan movement of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and it doesn't depend upon the accumulated credits of Varnashram Dharma. Prabhupada's commenting in lecturing on these verses in the 3rd chapter of Bhagavad Gita in 1968, you cannot again introduce the system of Varnashrama. It's not possible. But if one takes to Krishna consciousness, automatically he becomes immediately a Brahman and above the Brahman. A Vaishnava is above the Brahman. So, in that way, we can see that the development of Krishna consciousness and progress in Krishna consciousness, it doesn't rely upon previous performance of Varnashram Dharma, or even the performance of Varnashram Dharma as one is a devotee, because essentially, Kirtanadeva Krishna Sha Mukta Sangha Param Brajet. Asti Eka. There's one good thing about the Kali Yuga. Kirtanadeva Krishna Sha. It's the chanting of Hare Krishna, Mukta Sangha, which delivers us from the entanglement in the material world, Param Brajet, and can take us to the ultimate destination. So why Varnashram Dharma? Why our acharyas have included Varnashram Dharma in our program? Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he sat down in front of the picture of Gorkasur Das Babaji Maharaj. He gave himself sannyas. If you see the pictures of Thakur Bhaktivinoda and Gorkasur Das Babaji, they're not wearing sacred thread. They're not wearing sacred thread because they're in the Babaji ashram. beyond even Brahman, and completely avadut, liberated ashram, the Babaji Vesh. So Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, the mantras we're chanting, he actually established those mantras. And he initiated himself into those mantras of the Brahminical order and the ashrams. Why did he do that? As though he didn't know that simply by chanting Hare Krishna you can attain the supreme destination. Obviously he knew. However, for organizing the preaching mission, Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur incorporated, he utilized the Varnashram system to organize his mission. So he can have sannyasis who become the spiritual leaders of the movement, and the spiritual masters and the guides, the generals in the field who guide the foot soldier brahmacharis. And then those who are not in the renounced life, well they can take shelter of Grihastha ashram. Srila Prabhupada, he married, he's a sannyasi, he married, we can see the pictures in our Juhu temple when we visit. He had the program, Vegavan and another Amataji, he married them in the public Maidan, in the preaching program. There's a marriage. So in and of itself, you can get married 100 times and be an ideal grihastha, but it won't contribute to awakening prema, love of God, just being an ideal grihastha, or even a renounced sannyasi. These things are not mentioned by Rupa Goswami in the Sadhananga Sāra, 64 items of practicing bhakti. So why we're doing this? Because we can utilize the regulations and the guidelines of Varnashram Dharma to organize our own society and to show the example for humanity at large how they should be, how they can live. Let's review Arjuna's arguments for withdrawing from the fight. Up to this point, Krishna has addressed the first 3 arguments that Arjuna made about compassion by explaining the science of the soul in the 2nd chapter, 11 to 30. Arjuna's argument about enjoyment, Krishna's defeating that by explaining the principles of karma kanda, how by performing your prescribed duties you will enjoy. And Arjuna's argument of sinful reactions, Krishna's explaining how even at the level of karma kanda there's no sinful reaction, but at the level of karma yoga there is no reaction whatsoever, no pious reaction, no sinful reaction. Now there is still one argument as yet Krishna hasn't addressed, that is the destruction of the dynasty argument. And Krishna addresses that argument herein in the 3rd chapter. Verses 18 to 20 are describing that a self-realized man has no purpose to fulfill in the discharge of his prescribed duties, nor has he any reason not to perform such work. That means, as we've been describing earlier, that the Varnashram Dharma regulations are required for anyone who's influenced by the modes of material nature. And either they're following the principles of Brahminical life influenced by mode of goodness to remain pious and sinless, or the principles of the Kshatriya life if they're influenced by the mode of passion, etc. Now if the person has no influence of the modes of material nature, a self-realized soul, then there's no reason, he will not gain anything by following Varnashram Dharma, because Varnashram Dharma is meant to gradually bring you to a point of being desireless. Already, if you're desireless, no need for you to perform those regulative principles of Varnashram Dharma. However, at the same time, there's no reason why he shouldn't perform principles of Varnashram Dharma. We can consider an analogy in this connection. Like, for example, you have Chawan Prash. Chawan Prash. It's meant for a person with a cold. You take Chawan Prash. It's good. It builds up the immune system. However, even if you don't have a cold, you can take Chawan Prash. It's quite good, even if you don't have a cold. So the person who may not have a cold, he may be taking Chawan Prash just to set an example for the person who requires Chawan Prash and has a cold. And if that person is not setting the example, then the person who actually requires to take the Chawan Prash, seeing the person not taking it, may think, I don't need to take Chawan Prash. So, as Krishna is recommending here, for the sake of educating the people in general, you should perform your work. In other words, even though you don't require to perform the Varnashram Dharma regulative guidelines, to set an example for the society at large who do require to follow, then the liberated soul may follow the principles of Varnashram Dharma. And Krishna gives himself as an example in text number 22. Name paratashti kartavyam trishu lokeshu kinchana Nanavaptam avaptavyam vata eva chakarmi, that I have nothing to gain, I have no desires, there's no prescribed duties for me within all the three worlds. Nanavaptam avaptavyam, nor am I in want of anything, nor do I have a need to obtain anything. In other words, Krishna has no objective that requires to be fulfilled. He has no desires that require fulfillment by following the regulative principles of Varnashram Dharma. He's perfect being. He doesn't need to follow any regulations to purify himself or protect himself from degradation. However, Varta eva chakarmani, I'm performing the prescribed duties. What are some of the examples can you think of Krishna performing prescribed duties? Yes, Krishna, he performed the Vaidik Vivaha and he married 16,000 princesses. Actually, he could have skipped that step after rescuing the princesses who were captured by Bhaumasura. He said, girls, just keep in mind I'm the Supreme Personality of Godhead, so, you're already all my property. Let's just skip the wedding thing, big headache organizing all those weddings. But he didn't say that. He took each princess back to Dwarka and he married each princess separately, 16,100 Vedic vivahas with the priests and everything, to set an example. Prabhupada's commenting, although such rules and regulations are for the conditioned souls and not Lord Krishna, because he descended to establish the principles of religion, he followed the prescribed duties. Otherwise, common men would follow his footsteps because he is the greatest authority. So if Krishna were not following the prescribed duties of the Varnashram Dharma, then that would be the evidence upon which every common man could say, we don't need to worry about marrying the lady. When Krishna took Rukmini on his chariot and then took her away from the rival princes, it's not that he said, okay, that's it, I'm God, you guys just forget it. No, he turned and he fought Rukmini and the other princes as a Kshatriya would do, and victoriously he captured the bride Rukmini and took her on the chariot. When Raja Nagnajit invited all of the ruling monarchs and the great Kshatriyas and the Maharatis and the great heroes from all over the world to come and participate in the Sayamvara of his daughter, the princess, at that time Krishna, he didn't say, yes, I'll take the beautiful princess, she'll be fine, and I'm a Supreme Lord, so I'll just take her and go. No. Yes, Nagnajit said, yes, all you have to do is wrestle these 7 bulls. And Krishna didn't say, we'll skip that, I'm God, I don't need to go through these details. No, I'm ready. And immediately he tied his belt and expanded into 7 Krishnas. And he performed all of the different duties of the Kshatriya Dharma in order to set the example. Na kuryam karma ched aham shankarasya chakarta sham. If I did not perform my prescribed duties, all these worlds will be put into ruination. I would be the cause of creating unwanted population. Now this is interesting here. We can recognize one word here from Arjuna's comments in the first chapter, Arjuna's arguments. Arjuna was arguing that if I fight, then it will cause the rise of the unwanted population. And here Krishna is saying that if you do not fight, then because you are a hero and a leader and an influential person, your example will be followed by so many common people, and in that way the fundamental pillars of the Varnashram system will collapse, and the result will be destruction of the dynasty and the culture destroyed and the rise of unwanted population. So the very same argument Krishna is using to refute Arjuna's proposition. Arjuna is proposing, if I fight, it will, a Varnashram system will collapse. And Krishna is responding that if you don't fight, that will be the cause of the collapse of the Varnashram system. So in this way, he completely refutes Arjuna's arguments. Yad yadacharti shrestha tattadeve taro janaha shayat pramanam kurute lokastat anuvartate. Whatever action a great man performs, common men follow, and whatever standards he sets by exemplary acts, all the world pursues. This important verse is relevant for Arjuna's situation on the battlefield, as Krishna is explaining this principle, that therefore you should fight to set the appropriate example, and also in relation to our general example setting in the Krishna consciousness movement. Srila Prabhupada's commenting in his purport, Lord Chaitanya said that a teacher should behave properly before he begins teaching. One who teaches in that way is called acharya, or ideal teacher. The king or the executive head of state, the father and the school teacher are all considered to be the natural leaders of the innocent people in general. All such natural leaders have a great responsibility to their dependents. So similarly, the Krishna consciousness movement, we have a responsibility to the whole of society to set the appropriate example of how people should live. Now, because we are chanting Hare Krishna and serving Krishna, but performing bhakti actually is not so much required for us to perform principles of Varna, Ashram, Dharma, because by chanting Hare Krishna, we're all going to be liberated and go back home to Godhead. However, as we mentioned, Siddhanta Sastri Thakur, he introduced Varna, Ashram, Dharma to organize his preaching mission. And similarly, as a means of preaching, by following principles of Varna, Ashram, Dharma, like for example, Brahminical life, simplicity, cow protection, farming, all of these different aspects of the Varna, Ashram, Dharma, by performing those in an ideal way in the Krishna consciousness movement, we can set an example for the whole of the world how human society should actually live. Actually, the world is expecting an organization like the International Society for Krishna Consciousness to set such an example. And people look at the devotees and they're affected by the way the devotees lead their lives. So the way we deal with our rubbish, the way we generate funds, the way we build our residences, the way relationships with our families, the way we educate our children, all of these things, they're not directly the activities of sadhana bhakti, but these are activities regarding our lifestyle. And the common people, when they look at our members and our movement, these are the things that they see. So in this way, by, to whatever extent possible, applying in a practical way the principles and the guidelines of the Varna, Ashram, Dharma, then the International Society for Krishna Consciousness can influence the whole of the world to live in such a way, even if they may not be chanting Hare Krishna. But by seeing the lifestyle of the devotees and being inspired and imitating that will be beneficial for them and can protect them from sinful activity. So this is another important component of Srila Prabhupada's preaching mission to whatever extent possible, re-establish the culture and the system of the Varna, Ashram, Dharma. And as followers of Srila Prabhupada, we should work toward that goal. The topic of the third chapter, Karma Yoga, where Krishna is encouraging Arjuna, instructing Arjuna to perform his prescribed duties in a mood of detachment, and therefore incur no reaction for that karma. Arjuna asks in text number 36 that Arjuna uvacha athakena prayuktayam papam charati purushaha anichcham abhivashnaya baladevini ojita. What is it that impels a person to papam charati, to perform sinful activity? In this connection, a sinful activity would mean to act contrary to the prescribed duties of one's respective Varna and Ashram situation. To go against that is considered a pap, a sinful activity. Papam chariti purusha anichchan, against one's desire. Api barshnayad baladiviniyochita, as though one is forced to act in a sinful way. What is it that induces one to act sinfully? And Krishna responds in the remaining verses of the third chapter, and Krishna explains some very important principles of lust, which are very relevant for us. Let's examine some of the comments that Krishna makes. In text 37, Krishna explains, Sri Bhagavan Uvacha, Kama Esha Krodha Esha Rajaguna Shamudbhava Mahashana Mahapapna Vidyanam Ihavarnam, that this karma, this lust, is Rajaguna Shamudbhava, is produced from the influence of Rajaguna. So when the soul becomes influenced by the Rajagun, the eternal, pure love of God, which is inherent in the soul of the living entity, we are Krishna's lover, that becomes transferred, that becomes, you could say, Prabhupada uses the word in the purport, he says that it becomes transformed into lust. The love of God becomes transformed into lust due to the influence of the Rajagun. And the example Prabhupada gives is that milk, when it's influenced by, when it comes in contact with a sour agent, in dahi, yogurt, then all of the milk, it turns into yogurt. And in this way, it's transformed due to contact with the mode of passion. So Prabhupada's recommending, if therefore the mode of passion, instead of being degraded into the mode of ignorance, is elevated to the mode of goodness, by the prescribed method of living and acting, then one can be saved from degradation of wrath by spiritual attachment. In text number 39, Krishna is explaining Abritam Jnana Aitana Jnana no Nittabarina Kama Rupena Kunteya Dushparena Analenacha. The Abritam Jnana, one's knowledge, one's self-realization, Atma Tattva, who am I? I am not this body. It is Jnana, Dibbo Jnana. This becomes Abritam. It becomes covered over. We lose our Jnana. We become Ogyani again. We become in ignorance again as a result of unrestricted material enjoyment. Abritam. The effect, the result of lust and cultivating lust is that one's knowledge is covered and one again falls into darkness. Kama rupena kunteya, and this, the form of lust, Krishna is explaining it is analena cha, means it's just like a fire in which you add fuel to the fire. The fire is never satisfied. The more fuel that you add, the more ferocious the flames burn. It is dushparena. Dushparena means impossible to fulfill. Dushparena. Puren, to complete, dushparena, impossible to fulfill. Like a fire, it simply increases in its hankering. Prabhupada specifically mentions the fundamental attachment to the material world, sex, desire in the purport. While one enjoys sense gratification, it may be there is some feeling of happiness. Definitely there is some feeling of happiness. However, actually, this so-called feeling of happiness is the ultimate enemy of the sense enjoyer, because this is what bewilders us and causes us to fall into the darkness of ignorance and forget our spiritual identity. In the second chapter also, Krishna explained that bhoga shaya prashaktanam taya aparita chetasaham. Again, here the word is abritam. In the second chapter, the word aparita chetasaham. One's knowledge, one's realization becomes lost, becomes covered over as a result of bhoga and aishaya prashaktanam. Prashaktanam means excessive attachment. Bhoga means the pleasure that we get from our senses. Aisharja means the lording it over the material energy, the controlling the material energy. Wealth, attachment to sense enjoyment and wealth covers one's consciousness. Over-attachment to sense enjoyment and wealth covers one's consciousness. And in this way, Prabhupada comments, the so-called feeling of happiness is the ultimate enemy of the sense enjoyment. It would make a fantastic billboard, wouldn't it, that one? As you're driving from the airport in Mumbai and you see, our so-called feeling of happiness is the ultimate energy, the ultimate enemy of the sense enjoyer. It would certainly turn heads, a billboard like that. In text number 41, Krishna is concluding, Tasmat Tvam Indriyani Ado Niyamya Bharatashaba Papmanam Prajahiyanam Jnana Vijnana Nashanam. That this lust is Jnana Vijnana Nashanam. It destroys knowledge and self-realization. The more we indulge in lusty activities, the more our knowledge and bigyan, self-realization, is destroyed. And therefore we have to slay prajahi, the great symbol of sin that has to be curbed. And the method that Krishna recommends is Indriyani Ado Niyamya. Begin to Indriyani Ado in the beginning by controlling the senses. So the regulated lifestyle of Krishna consciousness, of course, is a very easy way of doing this. We can satisfy the urges of the body by engaging them in Krishna's service. We can eat prasadam. We can generate progeny for Krishna. We can talk for Krishna. And in this way we regulate the senses, and in this way we can curb the lusty propensity by engaging our mind wholeheartedly and senses wholeheartedly in Krishna consciousness. Prabhupada is recommending that if one is educated in Krishna consciousness from the very beginning, the natural love of God cannot deteriorate into lust. This is the advantage of a Gurukul education. If before one becomes accustomed to the life of sense enjoyment, if one is trained as a child in controlling the senses, in the Brahminical lifestyle, rising early, controlling the mind, a purified lifestyle, constant engagement in Krishna consciousness, then it's very easy for that person to awaken their Krishna consciousness, because the lust has not really been encouraged to rise and take hold in that person's consciousness, as we heard in the previous verse. Indriyani mano bhutir ashyad ishtanam uchate. That lust takes its position and takes a stronghold in the mind, in the senses, and in the intelligence. Lust takes hold of those key strategic positions in the consciousness of the living entity, and in this way completely controls the living entity. So that takeover of the strategic positions, that can actually be minimized greatly by proper Krishna consciousness education young in life. One can place Krishna in one's mind and intelligence. One can get trained by developing a Krishna conscious intelligence through training in Krishna conscious education. And one can develop an attachment and a liking for the essential activities of Krishna consciousness by regularly practicing them and getting trained. In that way, by a thorough Gurukul training, then the candidate has a much better chance. Prabhupada's continuing, when love of God deteriorates into lust, it's very difficult to return to the normal condition. However, nonetheless, Krishna consciousness is so powerful that even a late beginner can become a lover of God. So if one didn't have the fortune of having a Gurukul education and being trained in Krishna consciousness early in life, and the facility which makes it much easier for us to sustain our Krishna consciousness. In any case, one can take to Krishna consciousness at any time in life, later in life, because Krishna consciousness is so powerful that even a late beginner can become perfect, can become a lover of God by practicing Krishna consciousness. In this lesson, we were discussing the transcendental nature of Krishna consciousness, how it is completely independent of the practice of Varnashram Dharma. One doesn't require to practice any Varnashram Dharma in order to be eligible to begin Krishna consciousness. And practice of Krishna consciousness will yield all of the results that Varnashram Dharma provides. However, Varnashram Dharma still is important in the practice of Krishna consciousness. Krishna gives himself as an example. Now here he has no necessity to follow Varnashram Dharma, however, to set an example for common people, Krishna is following, because in that way, taking the evidence of Krishna's activities, the common person will follow yad. Sayat pramanam krute lokastada anavartate. Similarly, ISKCON as a society, even though by chanting Hare Krishna is all we require to go back to Godhead, still, because people will look at our society as a leader of humanity, and by demonstrating the ideal lifestyle of the Varnashram system, then we can set a wonderful example for society at large, so that even if they're not chanting Hare Krishna, at least they'll be living in a pious way and they'll gradually make spiritual progress. And of course, individuals in the Krishna consciousness movement, we discussed the example of Sanatana Saraswati Thakur, how beneficial the various ashrams are. Sannyas ashram facilitates the preacher. A brahmachari ashram can facilitate one in training in Krishna consciousness. Grihastha ashram can facilitate those in family life to practice Krishna consciousness and preach at home. And this way, the regulations of the Varna ashram, both Varna dharma and particularly ashram dharma, are also very useful for the practitioners of sadhana bhakti. And by following these guidelines, we can organize our lives in such a way to be very harmoniously situated and peacefully practice Krishna consciousness. And the various groups of the social body, the various ashrams, can all work together very cooperatively. In this way, we're utilizing the principles of Varnashram Dharma in the Krishna consciousness movement. We looked at Krishna's response to Arjuna's fourth reason for not fighting, of destruction of the dynasty. Krishna is explaining that if you withdraw from the battle, you'll set an example that the whole world will follow, and in that way they'll cite you as evidence and give up their own prescribed duties, and in this way the Varnashram system will collapse, and you'll be the cause of unwanted progeny. So Krishna completely turned the argument around. Arjuna inquires, what is the reason why a person deviates from their prescribed duties? And Krishna answers that karma esha, krodha esha, rajaguna samadbhava, the influence of lust as produced from contact with the mode of passion, and principles of lust, that it can never be satisfied, that it covers knowledge and self-realization. And Krishna recommends that lust can be dealt with by the gradual process of engaging the senses and following the regular principles of Krishna consciousness. Let's conclude the lesson with this quote from Srila Prabhupada. Therefore, this is the panacea to engage everyone in Krishna consciousness, chanting Hare Krishna. He comes above the highest principle of Brahmanism. This is the greatest gift to the humanity, that even he is in a fallen condition, the most degraded position. He can be raised to the highest position simply by chanting. This is the only remedy. Srila Prabhupada ki.